I can't see how many people we have there for this morning on day 2 of the DSA. Today's keynote is being given by our own Naomi Hossain, who was a global research professor in the Department of Development Studies, and she joined us last year, so it's a great pleasure to have her with us in the department and also to be one of our keynote speakers this year. So Naomi is a political sociologist working on poverty and precarity, and in particular, how people most in need get access to public services. Naomi's work focuses on the politics of development in Bangladesh and the politics of public services and disasters more broadly. Her work is focused on protest and civic agency, the role of aid, state accountability and responsiveness, elite perceptions of poverty, social protection, the political effects of disasters, and the role of protest in holding public authorities to account, in addition to other areas. She has worked with researchers from all over the world, as well as with social movements, civic actors, artists, aid agencies, and governments, and previously worked at the Research and Evaluation Division of BRAC, IDS at Sussex, and at the Accountability and Research Center at American University in Washington before joining us here at SOAS. So it's a real pleasure to have her speak here this morning, and just want to know we're starting a bit late, so we're going to try and stick more or less to the timetable, knowing that lunch is soon to follow after. So the format for the session will be that Naomi will speak for approximately 40 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. So those of you online will be keeping an eye on the questions that are posted there, and also we'll be taking the questions from the room as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Naomi.
Thanks so much, Tej. Thank you so much, everyone, for your incredible patience. Many thanks to the DSA, to the SOAS Organizing Committee, Winnie and Rowena, Christian, Nomad IT and people at SOAS who've made this possible, and to the Journal of Development Studies for sponsoring this talk. But I also wanted to thank Isma Firdaus, Mohammed Fazla, Rabbi Fatik, and the Dhakaiya Art Collective, because they let me share some of their wonderful pictures. And, you know, it's for me an enormous pleasure to be here. The DSA I always think of as my tribe. It's the only conference I go to regularly. I go when I'm not presenting a paper, just to see my old mates. So it's a great pleasure to be given a chance to witter on about Bangladesh at you for a number of minutes, because anyone who knows me knows that's exactly what I really like to do, is to talk about Bangladesh. I'm going to show you a lot of slides, and I'm going to, and if they, was that right? Yes. I am going to read a little bit because some of what I have to say has a bit of theory in it, and I find I'm better on the page than, you know, off the cuff. This is a talk about what it means for Bangladesh to be moving out of poverty, and specifically about what it means for its identity and place in the world. I will not talk about the economics of poverty or development. These issues have been very well rehearsed. I think there are about 4 books in the last year and a half which have explored the question of Bangladesh's surprising development success. And I reckon there's probably more than a few people in this room who have written their master's dissertation or their undergraduate thesis or their PhD or something on microfinance in Bangladesh. Come on, come on, be honest. How many microfinance? Okay, yeah, I thought so. So my focus here is on framings and images. And I want to draw attention to how Bangladesh is known only for the extreme nature of its development challenge, including the climate crisis now. As a poor country with no geopolitical significance or natural resources, no important cultural, historical, or religious status in the world, no real interest of foreign powers, Bangladesh has historically only ever stood out for its role as the world's laboratory for aid, a testing ground for experiments with capitalist development. And that role as the world's aid lab has depended on, harnessed, and helped construct an image of Bangladeshis as what Giorgio Agamben calls bare life, as people so helplessly on the permanent verge of annihilation from the forces of nature or political violence or the global economy that they lack the power to govern themselves, were not sovereign people or rights-bearing individuals. Ideas and framings of Bangladeshis constituted a regime of power with materially adverse effects for Bangladeshi and Bangladeshis. But now, in the space afforded by a degree of prosperity and sufficiency, and often in the online world, we are beginning to hear and see new versions of Bangladeshiness which move us far from such old imaginaries. Bangladeshi soft power is still very soft. The old image has not been erased, at least not in the north. But we are now seeing in books, films, art, and cuisine a Bangladesh that is celebratory and funny, cosmopolitan, ironic, knowing, and very current. I think some of what I'm going to talk about today will resonate, I think, in the present. When I think about the themes of the conference, about how we can even imagine the prospect of social justice in a polarizing world, I think like many people, and I know this from yesterday as well, I think many people, we think of Gaza and how those horrors that are going on in that part of the world are compounded and legitimated by active and deliberate efforts to dehumanize and to demonize. And I do wonder if social justice is even possible in a polarizing world that is marked by dehumanization and demonization of some groups of people by right-wing political actors and ideologies. There are so many reasons why this is deeply problematic. I'm not saying that if the people of Gaza were able to represent themselves better, that they would not therefore be subject to genocide. That's just naivete. But it is important for people like us, I think, to be alert to the signs and practices of dehumanization. In learning from its past effects, we should be able to change the way we think and work in development studies. I also wanted to give this talk. This is the only graph in the entire thing, just telling you now. My husband's an economist and he said, you can't talk about poverty and not have a graph. I'll put one graph. I wanted to give this talk because it allows me to share what I've been learning about interdisciplinarity in development studies, and in particular, the value of the arts and humanities in making sense of the development process. In this talk, and the book that this talk was supposed to have drawn from, but which has not yet been written. And this is a piece of advice for you all. Don't give talks on books you have not yet written. It's really not good. It didn't make me write the book. It made me spend a lot of time on a PowerPoint that nearly didn't get shown. So there we go. It's not only that these disciplines allow us to access ideas and feelings that even the most beautiful graph or table or social science paragraph cannot. The arts and humanities also help us to communicate more effectively to people whose primary ways of learning are not through words or numbers. They also provide ways of seeing and knowing that I think we're only really beginning to try in development studies. So this talk will actually be in 3 parts. So the next part is really about where we are now, current ideas and framings of Bangladesh, what it means to be Bangladeshi at a time when we are very slowly shedding the old identity as a poor country. And about the space for reimagining Bangladesh that wealth has created, particularly in the artistic domains. And then, in order to understand why these framings are so important, why these new framings are so significant for Bangladeshis, I'm going to take us to the past, to a time of Bangladesh's history in the early 70s, when Bangladeshis were seen, and pretty much without much pushback, as bare life, when Bangladesh was seen as an infeasibly impoverished Malthusian horror. People without civic or political capabilities or rights. And I want to, in that part of the talk, I'm going to highlight a few moments in Bangladeshi history which really indelibly created this image of Bangladesh as bare life. And then a little bit more briefly, I'm going to end with by bringing us back up to the present, and in fact, not to the present, but to look at what Bangladeshis are looking to for their future, how they're imagining their future, in particular through sci-fi, civic tech, and online art and entrepreneurialism, where we're seeing some very interesting, what have I done, new versions of Bangladesh emerging. Oh. So, wait, did I miss one? So, suffice it to say that Bangladesh is soon to move out of the ranks of the least developed countries, and is now, I think, officially a lower middle income country. Bangladesh is not a poor country anymore, at least not according to the facts. But it was only really that I started thinking about these things, about what it meant to not be poor anymore, when I took a trip with some old friends, very old friends. We've been friends since the 70s, since primary school. And they were all really successful in their professional lives. But even then, you know, I was a bit startled when one of them said, when we were going on this trip, he said, "Oh, you know, we're gonna have to fly commercial because helicopters are so expensive these days." And then, and these are really old friends of mine, I should say. You know, I've known them since we were like 7. And another one started telling us about his classic car collection, which is why he was on Top Gear. And I was just like, this is just not my lifestyle at all. It was a real eye opener. But those were really not the most interesting things to me about, these were not the strongest evidence of wealth, really. What really struck me was we were visiting this house, the new house of the third of our friends. It's near Sylhet. It's a beautiful house. He built this house quite recently. I'm a terrible photographer, I know, but it is a beautiful house. Architecturally and socially a beautiful house, I would say. Contemporary Bangladeshi architecture. I don't know if you've heard of Marina Tabassum. There's some amazing architects. They're winning lots of awards right now. I think this architect is also to be found in the pages of glossy magazines. But this house was so sympathetically positioned and used its very modern materials to build a beautiful traditional style courtyard house. Everywhere you looked, there was beautiful, lush, varied planting and landscaping, and the design made the most of the monsoon rains and the vistas of rice fields and coconut palms. The sociological design of this house was as successful as the architectural, in my view. My friend commissioned the house with his 2 brothers as a base for their entire clan, and it fits very well into the larger homestead of the extended family and the local community. The clan gathers there and spends holidays together, walking in the nearby tea gardens, visiting the local sweet shops, the Mishti Dokan, swimming in the discreet swimming pool, watching the monsoon rains. We ate exquisite Sylheti food with lots of shakkara. My friend is a true foodie and very much devoted to the terroir of the region. Terroir, is that how you say it? And I returned to Dhaka, not by helicopter, not by classic car, but all of us on the smelly old train, which was lovely, with a sense of lives being lived well in a way that wealth can but does not always enable. So this was a real moment for me. I have a little bit of an academic footnote for you here, which is, it is worth noting about this Bangladeshi elite, and it's the point I've been making for 25 years. It's not a very elite. The vast differences of wealth and distinction seen in the feudal and caste societies elsewhere in South Asia have not been an important feature of class relations in Bangladesh. It was historically somewhat flatter in terms of wealth and income, also lacked very strict social distinctions. And so the Bangladeshi elite has tended to have more affinities with the masses, at least in the recent past, and to be closer in many respects to the classes over whom they rule than the elites of other countries. A lot of people find this really surprising and they don't believe me. Many people feel that it can't be true because they can see extremes of poverty when they go to Bangladesh on the streets of Dhaka. And the point about that, I think, is that poverty in Bangladesh is all around you. It's not like Sao Paulo or New York, where you have the rich in their penthouses and you have the poor out of sight. It's not like that at all. You can always see the poor. I have a very good American friend who's worked a lot in Bangladesh, knows Bangladesh really well. And when I said to her once about Bangladesh being less unequal than America, her jaw just dropped. She could not believe, how could this possibly be true? Of course, America is more equal than Bangladesh. America is, of course, one of the top 3 most unequal countries in the world in terms of wealth and income and so on. But it's not so visible if you're a middle or upper middle class person. So I suppose that counts as a graph too, doesn't it? Oh, well, okay. Well, okay, that really was the last graph. But it's not a very elite. And it's this relative proximity between the elite and the masses in Bangladesh is why it is only recently that the rich could live well, like my friend with his beautiful new house, without fear of disapproval. When I studied the Bangladeshi elite in the late 90s, many were concerned that, you know, there were far fewer rich people and they were far less rich in those days. They should not show off their wealth. They should spend their surplus on charity and, you know, some artistic endeavors if necessary. You shouldn't show off. But now it is okay, it is socially acceptable to be rich in Bangladesh and to live well, visibly. And I suppose that is because there are so many more rich people that it is less remarkable. The rich do not stand out. It is also perhaps because it's less callous to live well now than in the 1970s, when millions of your fellow citizens were perched precariously on the edge of survival. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to skip Prince Musa. That's a real shame, another time. But it is now for the first time acceptable for rich Bangladeshis to live these kinds of rich and beautiful lives, that there are now enough rich Bangladeshis for someone like my friend not to stand out. This sense that wealth is only acceptably enjoyed and displayed without undue guilt or fear of the pitchforks when others around you are not starving is a distinctly different concept of wealth to the uber-capitalist idea of the individual rich man who's free to enjoy his wealth free of moral considerations about sufferings of others. I lived for almost a decade in the US, which I think makes me an expert in everything about America, right? Like if I was American, lived in Bangladesh for 8 years, I would be the world expert. So I am the world expert on American culture. And I think most Americans would agree that while it might not be kind of the very rich to live lavishly while their fellow Americans are struggling, it would not exactly be wrong to do so. It's fine. It's okay. It's morally fine. I started reading some of the anthropology of wealth, very interesting stuff. Another sense of wealth that is more commonly found across cultures whose origins and ethical frameworks predate this full-blown hyper-individualistic capitalism, greed is good. There are other ideas about wealth, and these earlier and still important meanings of wealth are not limited to the accumulation of money or assets. They do link wealth with social well-being, healthy and productive social relations, and political power and sovereignty, the idea of the commonwealth. But this elegant house of my friends brought to mind other reflections on what becoming not poor had meant. I noticed that we were seeing a uniquely and markedly Bangladeshi sensibility in the new era of art festivals, literary festivals, cultural events that we're seeing in Bangladesh now. These are events that celebrate the unmistakably Bangladeshi cultural qualities, a pungent masala of people, place, and ecology fermented on the globalized margins of late capitalism. Like the house, these transcend people and place to take a position in the international order of artistic endeavor, unproblematically excellent, available to a cosmopolitan audience beyond its borders. The Samdani Foundation, I think Bangladeshis will know of the Samdani art people will know of the Samdani Art Foundation. They're doing a lot for Asian arts, particularly strong example of the ways in which Bangladeshi wealth is projecting new visions of Bangladeshiness into the world. And it's not only through genius or chance that the Bangladeshi art now reaches beyond its borders. This is strategy. This is a plan. There is here, I think, a confident assertion of intrinsic merit, regardless of who is looking, of as yet untold importance to the rest of the world. So 2023, the same time I went on the trip, the helicopter trip, not a helicopter trip, with my friends, we also went to the Dhaka Art Summit, which is run by the Samdani Art Foundation. And it was fascinating. It was really, I mean, there's artists from all over the world. What's his name? Anthony Gormley had an installation there. It was amazing. But it seems clear that if Bangladeshi voices now resonate abroad, it is not only for good reasons. Battered by climate catastrophe, global shocks, rapacious markets, Bangladesh has a history packed with the kinds of crises the rest of the world is now getting used to. Perhaps these stories resonate because in the north now we're understanding about floods and disaster and climate change and volatile economic markets and financial markets and so on. The theme of the Dhaka Art Summit in 2023 was Bonna, which is floods. And it showed work on themes of genocide, violence, floods, and corruption. This is a picture of Joy Debraja's Submerged Dream 8, which imagined the flooding of Chakma lands. Does anyone here know who the Chakma were? Ah, yes, you know. Please tell us. That's right.
Who live in these hills, the hills called, starts with
Hilltrack.
R.
Rangamati.
Rangamati.
Yeah,
yes.
thank you. They are the indigenous people, the largest indigenous community. Sorry? Chittagong Hill Tracts, yes, and that area. But they are the indigenous people and the largest indigenous community. And their royal palace was flooded and submerged in 1962. And it's now a lake, and Bengali tourists go on a speedboat to say, how beautiful is this lake? And so in this artwork, they're lifting the Chakma Royal Palace up. This was 62 to build a dam for hydropower, I guess. So Rawaja turns this into a pool of tears, and the submerged Chakma Royal Palace is uplifted in a hopeless fantasy of justice. Dispossession and violence against indigenous people are also part of the Bangladesh story, but so is erasure. Few people at the exhibition had even heard this terrible story. Can you imagine? People didn't even know the story. Some of the people I was with, my helicopter friend, they didn't know about this story. The Samdani Art Award that year was won by Muhammad Fazla Rabi Fatiq's Mirage, a photographic series of failed development projects that offered a sharp comment on the costly hubris of economic development. Half-built raw concrete structures stood abandoned in their green landscapes, ghosts of progress, bridges to nowhere, at once eerily reminiscent of classical ruins and of the economistic calculus of development finance. Disconnected from real life, but costing real lives in the debt incurred by Bangladeshi people. But while these are familiar stories of corruption and authoritarian forms of development that ultimately leave the majority worse, I just want to see how this looks. Does it look good? But there is other art now. Ismail Firdaus is a photojournalist I've done some work with on the Rana Plaza disaster and aftermath, and we're hoping to do more work on that. But he recently won the Leica Award for this amazing series. He's won multiple awards, but Leica is the most recent one, and it's for this. And I love the fact that it's for this very frothy series of pictures. Ismail Firdaus' Sea Beach series of portraits of holidaymakers in Cox's Bazar. In Cox's Bazar, do you know what that means? Gently turns us away from the old imageries of bare and brutish lives. The saturated pinks and blues and yellows are the colors of a child's perfect day. Beach umbrellas and pony rides make it a familiar scene to the Western eye, but several elements disrupt this familiarity. The coordinated family outfits, the dressiness, the modest dressiness of folks on the day out, contrast with the unclothed sun worship you see on Western beaches. I absolutely love, this is my favorite. Look at her lip. Look at that. It's just astounding. So many stories in these pictures. There's so many, they're silly, they're funny. People are photographed in jeans, wearing garlands, in studied biker gear and diamante gowns. And I think that was a man, actually, the one in the diamante gown. Candy floss, balloons, holding hands, having fun. This is without a doubt my most favorite one. But if you happen to be in either New York, in the meatpacking district, or in France, actually, where is that? Does that give the details? In Paris, in the next few weeks, you can catch this exhibition, which has not yet come to London because British people are not interested in anything to do with Bangladesh. If the world is ready for images of a not poor Bangladesh, perhaps the artists equipped to craft these stories now have the space in which to do so, and yet the means of production of art have perhaps not changed all that much. Ismail was actually assigned to photograph the Rohingya people, displaced by the genocidal Myanmar regime, and it was this that brought him to Cox's Bazar after many years away. Brief detours from the grim assignments, reminded by his own nostalgia about family vacations as a child, let him uncover the frothy delights of sunlit days by the sea. You could argue, some have argued, that these are exclusionary cultural productions for the rich few. And this is true. This is mostly the upper classes, the middle classes, and the upper classes who are making this new art, which is not untrue of any other place. And there was always art, even before Bangladesh stopped being quite so poor. There was art in the dark times, but it was could only ever be art about the dark times, at least as far as the rest of the world went. Some people query the need for Bangladesh to address external audiences, to tell Bangladeshi stories to the world, perhaps seeing in the need to tell such stories evidence of a continuing colonization of the mind, which can only value what is ours when it is approved by more powerful cultural authorities abroad. But I do think that if development had not generated a flourishing of the fine arts, I think it would be Bangladesh's international image would still be one of disaster and crisis only. And I think we need to tell new stories about ourselves in Bangladesh. I'm now going to move on to, this is really the big part of the talk, bare life. Depictions of Bangladeshiness are particularly important because of the depictions of bare life that dominated international images of Bangladesh. I've already said I'm drawing on philosopher Giorgio Agamben's concept to describe a people facing such acute deprivation that they lack the protection or mandate of sovereign law. The concept originates with the figure of Homo Sacer, the accursed man, a figure who was below or beyond the scope of the law, someone who could be killed, but whose death could not be seen as a sacrifice or a crime. Agamben explored the concept in relation to the victims of the Nazis in the concentration camps. Scholars of development such as Jenny Edkins have used the concept of bare life to explore the political subjectivities of refugees, victims of famine. The Bangladeshi scholar, who is a geographer, Hosna J. Shuli, has applied it to Bangladeshis affected by displacement and those Chitmahal. What is the word for that? Enclave. Enclave. Thank you. Enclaves. Exactly. Some really nice work Hosna Shuli has on that. I find the concept helps me make sense of the conditions of the early 1970s in Bangladesh, when the newly minted state was unable to protect its people from death. So there are a few moments that really solidified this idea of Bangladesh's bare life. The first was the polar cyclone of 1970 that struck what was then East Pakistan. I'm going to really briefly take you through these historical moments, and there's loads written about them. I have written loads about them. There are academic articles and there are less academic articles that you can read if you're interested. The cyclone of 70 was the most devastating storm the world had ever seen, and maybe 500,000 people were killed. Nobody even knows. They didn't used to count people, well, not East Pakistanis in those days. Massive destruction. It was a really important moment. This is a quote from the journalist Sidney Scharnberg. The spectacular cyclone brought the world's lenses to East Pakistan or East Bengal. It revealed a place of great Malthusian horrors. There was a report by the CIA a little bit later. It was the first time they'd reported on Bangladesh to the US government, because of course, Bangladesh wasn't born until 1971. But they said it was just remarkable. They'd never seen such a concentration of poverty and deprivation and lack of natural resources. Like, they were almost, gobsmacked. They couldn't believe that such a place could exist. And the only reason they hadn't noticed it before was that it was part of a bigger and richer entity, which was either Pakistan or India. The geographer Mark Pelling has used the polar cyclone to theorize the politics of climate change adaptation, but otherwise it's relatively little known, I think, in the literature. More Sidney Scharnberg, some very important depictions of bare life there, but actually he does talk about the politics of the cyclone as well, the fact that West Pakistan failed to help. Some of the world's biggest aid NGOs, BRAC and Médecins Sans Frontières, got their start helping out in that disaster. So it was a pretty key moment in the history of aid and development. You've got to remember 1970, I mean, a lot of the news, TV news and other TV was black and white in those days. Like, it's not that long ago. But it was black and white, and yet it was this first time that these sorts of events were being seen on your TV and on your news coverage. The second moment really that cemented this image was in 71, 72, there was a war triggered, in fact, by, among other things, the callous response of the Pakistani authorities to the victims of the polar cyclone. Another story, there's a lot to be said about that. But there was a refugee crisis of really quite unimaginable proportions. About 10 million people, including millions of Hindus who were specifically targeted by the Pakistani army and its collaborators, were left displaced and starving, millions on the road to Calcutta. Again, the world's cameras showed up, and so did the world's poets and singers and musicians. There's a famous poem by Allen Ginsberg, September on Joshua Road. But there was also, of course, the Concert for Bangladesh. How many people here have actually heard of the Concert for Bangladesh? So nobody under the age of like 30, I think. Okay, I don't know how old you are. You look about 30. Yeah, so it's not very well known now. Wow. So this is where Live Aid. Wait, who's heard of Live Aid? Who's heard of Live Aid? Okay, a bit more, yeah. Okay, wow, that's a long time ago, isn't it? Charity concerts, anyway. The Concert for Bangladesh was, okay, wait, who's heard of George Harrison? The Beatles? The Beatles? Do you know, when I was young, I thought the Beatles were something special about Bangladesh, actually. I didn't realize that everyone knew the Beatles. I thought they were like, our band, they were our people. So it was a surprise to know that everyone knows the Beatles and George Harrison's super famous. But in 1971, he was very good friends with the Bengali classical musician Ravi Shankar, and the refugee crisis started. And Ravi Shankar said, he said to his friend George Harrison, let's have a concert, we'll raise $25,000 or whatever, and we'll send it to the refugees. It was a terrible situation. Nobody was even saying the word Bangladesh at this point. And he wrote this song, which is, I think we can admit, a dreadful song, absolutely awful. But it was an amazing concert. They raised funds, and very importantly, they put the name Bangladesh on the agenda. It really was it was the first time people were talking about Bangladesh in ordinary public discourse. It was a political act, but it was also an act of solidarity. It was the model for Live Aid, and so in that sense, another pioneering moment for development in aid. And it was also an epic moment in the history of celebrities in aid. Bob Dylan came out of retirement to perform, one of his early retirements anyway. And Ringo Starr and Eric Clapton were in the backup band. Old people, we know these names, the rest of you don't know these names. But the images used in the song, We've Got to Relieve Bangladesh, lodged a particular vision of Bangladesh in Western minds. The Simpsons actually has 2 episodes in which versions of the concert for Bangladesh are played out. And I understand that is some kind of marker of cultural penetration. These images, anthropologist Naomi Mukherjee has written very interesting work on this. They really cemented a view of Bangladesh as a place and people of utter dependence, utter helplessness, dependent on Western assistance. It was a really interesting moment, that concert. There's also one other thing, which I'm beginning to sound like that, in Goodness Gracious Me, when the guy, anything to do with India's, I'm beginning to sound like that. Everything is to do with Bangladesh. Everything is. But actually, this book was actually written in response to the refugee crisis of 1971. Do people know this book by Peter Singer? This essay, Famine, Affluence and Morality. Who's heard of effective altruism? Okay, so this is the founding text of the effective altruism movement. This was written in response to the refugee crisis. So that movement is followed by Bill Gates, Sam Bankman-Fried, now in jail. I guess he's not following it anymore. And I think it's a philosophy that erases any historical responsibility of the affluent for the poverty or desperation of other societies, and it moralizes the vast power granted to tech billionaires and their ilk to decide how people in poverty and crisis should live. It is the perfect moral creed for late global tech-driven capitalism, and it too was prompted by a perception of the bare lives of Bangladeshis. Another infamous moment, this is the last of my moments, another infamous moment in which Bangladeshis were lastingly depicted as bare life was in the throwaway comment by Henry Kissinger. Who's heard of Henry Kissinger? Okay, yes, thank you. At the time, National Security Advisor to the Nixon regime, later Secretary of State, and he said that Bangladesh would not be our basket case. This is quite a famous exchange, and Bangladeshis all know this. They all misquote it horribly, but anyway, this is the actual text, what was actually said. I've highlighted the key part. I think, like President Trump's more recent use of shithole, this label is a crude foreign policy précis. These are people and places of no value to us and our interests, and for whom we should expend little effort. And I think there's a few things. This was a big meeting. This is an important meeting that this was said. And I think there's several points about this exchange. This is 1971 still, that are of interest. The statement was made during a high-level cross-governmental meeting. These were important people. Their views mattered, and their views stand on public record as insights into decision-making that had profound human and historical consequences. This powerful policy space explicitly considered the possibility of famine as a factor in their decision-making, almost 3 years before a full-scale famine did, in fact, occur in Bangladesh. This was a live possibility in the minds of American policymakers, and they had time to think of how to respond. The statement that Bangladesh was not necessarily our basket case speaks of a willingness to jettison humanitarian responsibilities towards that country, to treat the whole country as bare life, in effect. So I think when he talked about famine in that basket case, most people focus on the basket case bit. I focus on the bit when he's saying we're not going to help if there's a famine, because in 1974, I think Amartya Sen has written the really famous piece about this. There was a massive famine in Bangladesh after massive floods. And the US withheld food aid to Bangladesh in 1974, officially on grounds that trade with Cuba made it ineligible for US food aid under Public Law 480. By the way, if anyone ever wants to do a PhD on this, please send them my way. I'd really like to supervise PhDs in this area. By the time US food aid finally arrived, the peak of the famine had passed. In the exchange I just showed you, Kissinger seems to have unseemly alacrity to think about what our policy will be. Aid in the 1970s served brutal foreign policy ends, even though it professed humanitarian aims and altruism. This included coercing Bangladesh into an early and protracted dependence on external aid, driving it into more open and frequently exploitative global markets. 1.5 million Bangladeshis, 2% of the population of the time, died in the 1974 famine. I don't think people really know much about the 1974 famine. There remains much to be understood and researched about the US response. Why did they deliberately withhold aid to starving Bangladeshis? If so, why? A popular theory that was doing the rounds of Washington, DC policy circles in the early 1970s was that of triage theory, which argued that US food aid was stupidly generous. US food aid policy was stupidly generous and needed to triage those who needed help so as to teach some countries a lesson. So they would shift to green revolution technology, stop having so many brown and black babies, and stop needing food aid. And there are some reason to believe that this theory was actually doing the rounds in the circles that made food aid policies that affected Bangladesh. There's a similar theory, Lifeboat Ethics by Garrett Hardin. I don't know if these theories, which I still see traces of in public policy talk, I don't know if people know where they come from. Like the Lifeboat Ethics, you know, it could come straight out of the mouth of Donald Trump or indeed some of our own rulers here. But the Lifeboat Ethics said that the West cannot go on indefinitely bailing out and helping poor nations. There's no room left on our boat. And I think this should all be familiar to anyone who's paying attention to the ideologies of the rising groups of white supremacists discussing great replacement theory, among other racist zombie theories. This is a racist. Alex Dewell uses this language of zombie theories to describe theories about overpopulation as a cause of hunger and famine, and the fact that despite all the evidence against such theories, they are unkillable. They keep being killed and they come back to life. This is from the Paddocks, from their infamous book. It's a really terrible book. You really should read it. Really, really terrible book. But it was a bestseller, I think. And you know that these ideas linger. I was in a presentation about 2 years ago about Bangladeshi research into human rights, and a retired ambassador from a rich and powerful country, someone who I would estimate was of a vintage and a milieu to have dined with Henry Kissinger. And this person dominated the Q&A with entirely irrelevant questions about the size of the Bangladeshi population and its growth rate. Literally, the only thing this top flight cosmopolitan diplomat knew of Bangladeshis was that there were too many of us. And actually, my students in that session, they're all Gen Z, they were absolutely horrified. Absolutely horrified. They were all WhatsApping each other going, what? Like, this is not how they think of anywhere, I think now. So moving on to the last very brief bit, to the future. So that was the past, we've done the present, and now to the future. And here I'll be brief because the future hasn't happened yet. And also I have not really had the time, and I don't really have the skill, I'll be honest, to analyze all the fascinating art and literature and other cultural and political presentations that I'm seeing. I've been quite inspired by this idea of Afrofuturism. I think for Bangladeshis as well, there's a sense of Banglafuturism, thinking about technology. In many ways, we have to leapfrog. Some of the imaginaries that I've been seeing about, you know, in Bangladeshi sci-fi and all that, there's a lot of emphasis on flying cars, and it makes me think about two things. One being the traffic in Dhaka, and the other being, of course, that we're, you know, the water levels are rising. You know, in some part of your brain, you've got to be thinking about what do you do when the land is gone, some part of us. And I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time and move on to one of my absolute most favorite art companies, art collectors, which is Dhakaya. It's spelt Dhakaya in English, but Dhakaya is somebody who's really, really from Dhaka. And this is a genre of graphic art. Some of it's used for advertising and other things. Very popular prints of Bangladesh. It bills itself as an illustrated love letter to Dhaka, which is, you know, let's face it, possibly the most unloved city in the world. But Dhaka is one of those artistic interventions that made me think things are changing. Aren't they beautiful? These images fill the Dhaka imagination with tales of forbidden romance. Pretty much all romance is forbidden in Dhaka. A female freedom against an apparently intractable patriarchy, and often subversive little tales about resistance to class and patriarchal privilege and power. Look at those witches, isn't that great? Can you see the details? See the skulls and the hearts and what they're doing? It is a dark, almost Gothic sensibility, which is enchanted by the charms of its hometown and which seeks to reimagine it for women and girls and also for the non-elite. There's a whole story there on Instagram you can read. They've got a whole story here. It's really quite dark. I'm recently also, I was at, now who is the person who edited the new Bengali book of short stories? Who was the, what's his name? Somebody tell me, somebody knows this. Anyway, I was at a talk that he was giving at the Jaipur Lit Fest a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that Bangladeshi, so the Bengali literature, Bangladeshi literature, he says he thought Bangladeshi literature has a kind of an edge. It's not so preoccupied with traditional forms. There's a kind of crazy sci-fi thing going on there, fantasy literature, not necessarily my favorite genre, but nonetheless, it's very interesting to see people like Saad Hussein, no relative as far as I know, who's been winning awards with his books on sci-fi and fantasy. There's quite a lot of knowing and darkness in these. So he imagines in this book, Cybermage, Hussein imagines a world about 50 years hence when nationhood has been replaced by corporate identities in which useful citizens are given stocks in the corporation, and the rest become incubators for nanotech that produces resistance against disease, the ultimate resilience. How many times have we heard about Bangladeshis being resilient? And makes the world inhabitable. I think it's unsurprising that Bangladeshi artists and writers should be imagining a world wrought by climate change, because scientists believe the future of Bangladesh is not so much uncertain as it is submerging. I love this dig at the aid industry here, the welfare workers, the tree huggers, other molesters, that's us. So a final word on Bangla futurism must come from the government itself, which has set up a whole unit dedicated to digital innovation attached to the Prime Minister's office. Starting in 2008, A2I, Aspire to Innovate, is responsible for a number of changes in how the Bangladeshi state is engaging with its citizens. The vision for 2041 is now something called Smart Bangladesh, and it is an economic growth and service delivery agenda which aims to harness benefits of tech, particularly for ag, small and medium enterprise, health and education, urbanization, all government services. I think there's a lot of influence from Silicon Valley, but the emphasis is very much on prosperity, equitability, and caring. Certainly in Smart Bangladesh, the government is learning to listen better to its citizens, but it is also possible that being more responsive is obviating the need to be more accountable. A few final thoughts from me. This is a development studies conference, so I thought I should have some policy recommendations. Really, you're laughing? I actually have some. I think if Bangladesh is to ever truly move out of the ranks of poverty, it will need more than GDP growth. Yeah, we all know that. But it will need for its people to be able to live beautiful and creative lives and to tell their stories on the world stage. At a time when AI is threatening to take over all our jobs, the creative sectors may very well have the edge. Bangladesh's rich and vibrant artistic heritage gives it a comparative advantage in this area. But they need to invest vastly more in Bangladesh's education system, from the very basic system to the institutions of higher education. Education remains grotesquely underfunded in Bangladesh, even by South Asian standards. Also need to support the institutions of the cultural institutions that enable broader lifelong learning, including adult and artistic education, if Bangladesh is ever going to be smart. And creativity and innovation don't just happen, they are invested in and supported and given space to flourish. In a Bangladesh where speech is constrained and social media posting can land you in jail, and I'm not exaggerating, it is remarkable that there is any art at all. Smart Bangladesh requires an open and competitive politics where the people decide who rules them and how, as well as a growing and diversified economy, and only then will we be able to say that we are no longer poor. Exactly. 39 minutes, 59 seconds.
Thank you, Naomi. Okay, we have some time for questions. I'm actually going to stay here, I think, and allow you to stay there, Naomi, if that's all right.
Sure.
So we'll take a few questions from the room, and we'll also be then looking online. If you would like to raise your hand if you have an immediate question for Naomi. I just see, so you, please, yes.
Hello, amazing talk. I'm an architect myself, so I was really surprised about the tone that your talk acquired. I'm also from Latin America, and what you said was reflecting on when you were talking about the comparison of inequality between Bangladesh and the United States. And something that we know in Latin America, and especially in South America, is that one thing is income inequality, and the other thing is segregation, territorial segregation. I was wondering what you think about the immediate evolution of the level of segregation. What you were talking was basically no or low segregation. But in Latin America, we have cases when we, even with the same level of inequality, people can live closer or further away. So, but in the places where we have more segregation, at some point, one group decided that one wanted to be further away or to push some of the people that were living close to them to other places, basically through military dictatorships. So I don't know what you think that maybe where are the energies going now that more wealth is present?
I mean, I can answer that immediately. There's more talk of and more effort to invest in gated communities now in Dhaka city. But you know, the land is very densely populated, it's very small. It's still some way before that segregation is really a real thing. It's not only physical, it's social as well. Everyone, if you're middle class or well off, you will have relatives who are not so well off. So you have these kind of social ties that are very, I think, remain relatively strong, but are definitely weakening, I would say.
Hi, that was great. Thank you so much, Naomi. So I just, you know, the whole notion of bare life, I think that you really evocatively brought it out. And by the way, also thank you very much for the use of the arts and humanities. And I think we're seeing that more and more in the DSA also, and that's great, the use of that in development. So I guess around bare lives, you know, you have that today too, because if you look at how was the Iraq war justified? If you look at what's going on in Gaza, but also Tigray and Sudan, the difference between the reactions there with war and famine, and then when you have a war in Ukraine, and the kind of mindset of policymakers. So, I mean, how does one counteract that? But also, I think the elites in South Asia, in Bangladesh, in India, elsewhere, I mean, there is also a huge gap between the way the poor in these countries are dehumanized, you know, in terms of around class, caste, religion, etc. So I think there's quite a lot of work in addressing some of that. So I wonder if you have any insights on how we can counteract that.
Shall I just respond? What do you want me to do, Tej? Shall I just respond as we're going?
I think there were no hands at all.
That's fine.
Let's take two more questions. Is that okay? Yeah.
There's one at the front there.
Let's go with your one.
Well, Lila, I do think that, yeah, I think exactly that, you know, as all of these thoughts were coming through my head, you know, it's how you look. You know, Nixon famously said about Bangladeshis, Americans wouldn't care, it's just a bunch of goddamn brown Muslims, he said. He was a lovely man, that Nixon. Nearly as nice as Kissinger. But that's it, you know, if you don't look like the people who are telling the stories, the people who are making the stories, then it's very difficult. And I agree also that the elites have a way of demonizing, dehumanizing. I was always very struck when I did my work on the Bangladeshi elite 25 years ago, that they made a great point of not saying that that poor Bangladeshis were guilty, that it was their fault that they were poor. They even wouldn't blame them for theft. Like they would say things like, well, a hungry man is going to do what he has to do. There's a real kind of moral forgiveness, which you don't find in other societies. I think that's an effect of that proximity there, that culture of they had this very strong egalitarian culture and it lasted. I don't think it's there now, but it was there when I did that work, even a generation back.
We've got two questions. Could you just,
Yeah,
sorry, could you just introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah,
Well, I didn't.
Sunil Kumar from Social Policy at LSE. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the other arts. I'm thinking about poetry, film, music, drama, street art, for example. So I think there's a lot of potential positivism to come out of that kind of art, which has been kind of silenced in this presentation.
Silenced?
In a sense that you made mention of it, but really didn't speak about it. So I just wanted to know if you wanted to expand it.
I'll say first, my Bangla is really terrible. So I don't really, like if I have to read a Bangla book, I have to get my dictionary out and hours later I'm on page 2, that kind of thing. So everything is, for me, I've pitched this at how Bangladeshis are pitching, their culture to the world, actually mostly to the diaspora, I think. And a lot of it is in English or Benglish so that people like me can consume it. I'm not a great one for poetry in any language. So there is film, there's some really great film. I would love to look at that if I had time and space, but these are the things that really came to my attention. I love to see the arts. I'm very interested in photography. I've been working with this photographer, Isma, for those. So that's why it was kind of very selective. Yeah. Thank you. Street art. Oh, and so they built all these hideous flyovers, right? So, it looks like any other Southeast Asian city now in Dhaka. But what they've done is somebody in their wisdom has commissioned, I think, fine arts students to do murals all over these hideous concrete structures. And they're just beautiful. It's just stunning. It just is just a delight, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. So it's all they're using this, street art has become, municipal art, public art.
The question is whether it is political or depolitical in that sense. Because some of the street art can be quite political.
Street art is always political. Always.
I will look into this. I will think about this a bit more. I think it's a very good point. Thank you.
All right, shall I go for it? Hi, I'm Portia Roloffs, King's College London. Really fascinating presentation.
Oh, there you are. Sorry, I was looking for you everywhere. Hi, Portia.
So I had one clarification question. So I'm not quite sure how you're using bare life, because the sort of cultural productions of bare life that you've highlighted, people in kind of critical development studies are often like, it's just a construction and it's problematic and we should do away with it. But I think you have more of an ambivalence in your kind of sympathy for Harrison's song and whatever. So are you saying like how are you using bare life? Do you think it objectively describes something that's going on, and maybe that's just because of the contingent conjuncture of just some really awful things that were happening? And then I'd also wonder if you could comment on a debate that's been ongoing this week about what does Bangladesh tell us about the kind of shift to a global development paradigm? Is it a poster child for the fact that we've achieved development, so we're living in a kind of post-development world, or just how would you connect the story you're telling to that question?
That's great. When I realize we're already 1 minute into lunchtime, so I'm feeling really guilty already. Please hold just for a few more minutes. No, is that all right? It's a really good question. Thank you. Yes, a bit ambivalent. I'm not trying to say these framings were false in any meaningful sense, but they have political effects. They did have. I'm not trying to say, oh, it was just a construction, it's just an idea and ideas are just in our heads or something. I'm saying, no, I think I would be foolish to try and argue this in an empirically causal manner. But I do think that having constructed Bangladeshis' bare life, when 1974 came, it was pretty easy for American foreign policy to say, you know what, let's just see what happens if we don't give them food aid. Let's triage these people. Let's see. Because they were disposable, dispensable. No, they were no use to Americans geopolitically. So I think it was a time, and there are people who've said this was their experiment, just like the British had done in Ireland 125, 30 years earlier. They used the Irish famine to experiment with various kinds of social policy or lack thereof. I think perhaps that's what was going on in 1974 with American, but you know, only in the sense that they didn't really care. There was a good excuse for not giving aid, so we may as well see what happens. And that's what happened.
Okay, we have, I think it looks like 2 more questions, one here and one over.
Thank you, Professor Hossain. That was such a wonderful talk. As much as I've enjoyed watching all the contemporary art and I'm following all the accounts on Instagram, I should mention I'm Mirna Guha and I'm in sociology at Anglia Ruskin University. I'm from Kolkata and I've worked in Bangladesh for some years within the NGO sector. And you know, as much as you talk about the need to invest in art to move beyond being poor, in quotes, I'm also thinking about how literature festivals and art festivals reproduce class inequalities. And you know, thinking of what the first speaker said, often these spaces become spaces of segregation. And I remember a particular visit I made to Dhaka for work, where we were working with street children who are vulnerable to abuse and violence. There was a concerted effort to take them to an art exhibition to enrich their minds. And there was so many complications in trying to get permission to have these young people access these spaces, which were fiercely guarded. So they were seen as spaces where only certain consumers could come in. And that continues. And I see that in Kolkata, and I see that in places like Dhaka as well. And also these spaces, even though they do cater to the diasporic imagination, I think there are interesting tensions in the way diaspora kids consume and participate in these spaces, because diaspora kids don't necessarily come from the elite, particularly, you know, Bangladeshi young people. And so a lot of my friends from the UK who visited Dhaka and been to these spaces, the display of almost Savarna-like caste performance in these spaces is something that's disturbed them. And as soon as they've said, oh, I'm from Luton or I'm from, you know, Bradford, that's led to a certain kind of behavior. So I was just thinking of, you know, could you reflect on this in the role of art in like reproducing kind of inequalities?
Just dream questions as far as I'm concerned. Thank you. Yes, I think fascinating. You know, art philanthropy, of course, is clearly important in elite construction, the construction of elite identities and elite practices. And we're seeing that. And it's not just art philanthropy, it's other kinds of philanthropy as well, the creation of habitus of taste and so on. But philanthropy is emerging in a very interesting way in creating this us and them sort of this quite strong us and them division, I think. But you said something else about, there was something very interesting you just said. Oh yes, about the fact that the diaspora is not itself very elite. And I think this is very important. So, you know, Bangladeshis travel around the world, mostly not because they're posh kids going off to college, but mostly because they're going off to work in quite basic, relatively low-skilled industries. So Bangladesh is a cosmopolitan but proletarian. And this is a very interesting thing when you think about what kinds of reflections they will have of the North, of the experience of being in the West, the experience of being in other countries as well. It's a very, so I have hopes that some of the art that we will start to see reflected in here will reflect that cosmopolitan proletarian perspective. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm probably not looking at the films and things, which I think are where those are. You know, I think in Italy, for instance, there's been some really interesting Italian films, I think, about Bangladeshis, which I haven't seen yet. Anyway, yes, we can keep going on. Talk to you later.
Hi, my name is Valera Saenko. I'm from Scuola Normale Superiore. I just finished my PhD, and I have a question about the initial part of your presentation, and somewhat connected to the previous question, to be honest, is, or some of other questions actually, but don't you think that specifically what you mentioned, that the more richer parts, at least the upper middle class or richer parts of society are the ones creating art, and the art that is being created now, the idea of this sort of self-aware, this funny images of Bangladeshi people, isn't it art that kind of tends to the Western eye, to the Kissingers and Nixons here in the West and the global North, presenting Bangladeshi as harmless, as funny, and this is not the art. The art that depicts or the images of Bangladesh as poor was presented by the Western researchers as well, showing, or George Harrison even, again, a Westerner, saying this is a poor country. And we need more art from Bangladesh by the poor, because otherwise then we will have this idea, not the idea, but then again, this segregation, separation, class separation will be further recreated. And don't you think that this is, instead of having this sort of opportunity now that art is being created by Bangladeshi people, isn't it a bit of a warning sign that the rich parts are creating art and that class will be separated even further and that the poor will have less voices in the future?
Well, congratulations on your PhD. That's wonderful. And thank you for that. Yes, I think those are really interesting questions. I do think, though, that if we can only allow art when it's entirely democratic and when people from all classes equally participate, we're going to have a lot less art. I think we all know that the space for creative, like academic, let's face it, endeavors are greatly enabled by a nice fat cushion of wealth, right? There is a lot of folk art now being elitized, commercialized, brought into the sector, brought into the imagination. I think it's very interesting. I posted on Twitter, I'm a lot on Twitter, I'm afraid, about these cricket bats the other day, cricket bats covered in rickshaw art or truck art, I think you would say in Pakistan. So one of my favorite things is rickshaw art, but everything now is covered in rickshaw art. So we've gone folk art and turned it into this elite kind of household accessory. It's everywhere now. It's done. I think it's finished. But I think that yes, it will create divisions. I think that we have the barest of investment in public schools in Bangladesh, the barest of investment in the universities and in the cultural institutions. I think one of the things about not being poor is that they must spend more money on this stuff. You know, the government of Bangladesh has recently decided that they're going to be Finland in education terms. And it's like, I'm not seeing it yet, you know, the money is not where the mouth is. They have these aspirations, but really to get to that stage, they have to be a lot more democratic, where they're spending a lot more pro-poor. I don't think any of this stuff is meant to persuade Henry Kissinger or any Americans. Americans are not interested. I don't think many people in Britain are. These are really for domestic consumption. It's in Bangla. It's not. It's very much about us. It's projecting to the world, but it's about what we think and we feel. I think that's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi.